herzlich willkommen heute zu unserem Vortrag oder zum Vortrag von Eleonora Rohland in unserem Kolloquium. Wir haben uns ja in diesem Kolloquium in diesem Semester ein Thema gegeben, um über Sicherheit und Unsicherheit nachzudenken, und ich freue mich total, dass wir Eleonora Rohland, unsere Kollegin aus der Verflechtungsgeschichte der Amerikas, zu gewinnen, um heute mit uns darüber nachzudenken oder uns einen Vorschlag zu machen, wie man aus ihrer Forschung heraus darüber nachdenken kann. Auch wenn Eleonora schon seit einigen Jahren hier in der Fakultät ist, uns vorstellen, wie sich das gehört. Ich habe eben schon gesagt, wir sind da ganz traditionell. Ich habe also auch ein paar Bücher dabei, die ich gleich rumgeben werde, die bestimmte Stationen auch in deiner wissenschaftlichen Karriere repräsentieren. Also studiert an der Universität Bern Geschichte, Linguistik, englische Linguistik und mittelalterliche Geschichte, also Vormoderne sozusagen von den Anfängen. Dann promoviert in Bochum zu einem Thema Hurricanes in New Orleans 1718 bis 1965, A History of Adaptation. Und wenn ich das richtig sehe, ist das sozusagen die Printversion.
Genau, sehr teure, gebundene Version.
Dann fangen wir jetzt mal an, das in die Runde zu geben. Changes in the Air, Hurricanes in New Orleans from 17-something to the present. 2014 promoviert und dann Habilitationsäquivalenz, Anerkennung und erfolgreiche Junior, wie man das so macht, erfolgreich evaluierte Juniorprofessur bzw. Verlängerung hier bei uns an der Abteilung für Geschichtswissenschaft als Professur für allgemeine Geschichte unter besonderer Berücksichtigung der Verflechtungsgeschichte der Amerikas in der Vormoderne. Das ist immer ein langer Titel, aber eigentlich genießen wir das, glaube ich, alle sehr, dass wir zumindest grundsätzlich die Berechtigung haben, ganz viel über Geschichte nachzudenken, ob nun im 17., im 10. oder dann auch in der Moderne. Du warst Stipendiatin der Schweizerischen Studienstiftung, hast Koordination des Graduiertenkollegs übernommen in der Schweiz, Herausforderungen, Demokratie durch den Klimawandel, also
Das war am KWI.
Entschuldigung, das war am KWI in Essen, sorry, das wollte ich, genau. Unter der Leitung von Klaus Leggevi, also das Graduiertenkolleg. Es zeigt also schon deinen Schwerpunkt in der Klimageschichte, Umweltgeschichte im weitesten Sinne, Nachdenken über das Verhältnis von Mensch und Umwelt, ich nenne es jetzt mal so, auch wenn das sicherlich Teil
wir kommen heute sicher noch dazu,
der Diskussion sein kann. Genau, viele Projektkoordinationen, erfolgreich, vor allen Dingen auch in Bielefeld, dann als Direktorin des Center for Inter-American Studies und auch unter Beteiligung oder unter deiner Beteiligung eingeworben das Merian Center des Callas in Guadalajara, und das ist, glaube ich, einer unserer Sendposten sozusagen in den Amerikas, vor allen Dingen natürlich in Lateinamerika. Forschungsschwerpunkte, Verflechtungsgeschichte der Amerikas, das habe ich schon gesagt, Umwelt- und Klimageschichte, historische Katastrophenforschung. Und unter diesem Aspekt bist du auch sozusagen Mitglied bei uns in der Gruppe, die sich intensiver darüber Gedanken macht, wie man mit diesen Konzepten von Uncertainty eigentlich in der Geschichtswissenschaft umgehen kann. Ich freue mich sehr über deine Beteiligung. Ich mache jetzt nicht noch eine lange Liste deiner bisher erschienenen Publikationen. Ich möchte noch 2 Bände rumgeben, weil die in der Bibliothek sind. Und heutzutage muss man ja dazu sagen, vieles davon, was du publiziert hast, vor allen Dingen zu den aktuelleren Themen, sind natürlich online verfügbar. Da müssen Sie vielleicht selber noch mal den einen oder anderen Klick in die Bibliothek wagen. Ein Band Entitled Histories and the Environment, Socio- and Environmental Transformations in the Caribbean und ein Band zum Krisenklima, wo du auch mit Herausgeberin warst. Das gebe ich jetzt noch mal in die Runde und freue mich dann vor allen Dingen auf deinen Beitrag zum Thema Uncertain Knowledge in Unfamiliar Environments, Spanish in Hispaniola, 1492 to 1496. The floor is yours.
Okay. Ja, ganz herzlichen Dank für die Einladung, für die sehr, sehr freundliche Einführung. Ich freue mich sehr, hier heute über dieses Thema zu sprechen und werde das gleich auf Englisch tun, was immer so ein bisschen schräg ist, irgendwie, wenn man eigentlich ja im deutschsprachigen Kontext ist. Die Textgrundlage ist in Englisch und so schnell konnte ich die jetzt nicht übersetzen. Aber wir diskutieren natürlich gerne dann logischerweise auf Deutsch. Und vielleicht gerade noch zu den Publikationen. Also das, was ich hier vortragen werde, ist eigentlich Teil dieses orangen kleinen Bandes, Entangled History and the Environment, Fragezeichen. Das ist durchaus auch so als so immer noch Baustelle gedacht, auch meinerseits, und ist eigentlich ein Teil oder so eine Vorpublikation sozusagen von einer Anrecherche eines längeren Buchprojektes, was ich jetzt auch ganz kurz gleich nochmal erläutern werde. genau, ich habe so die etwas unangenehme Ahnung gehabt beim Vorbereiten, dass einige von Ihnen euch diesen Vortrag schon mal in einer anderen Konstellation vielleicht gehört haben. Ich bitte also, das so ein bisschen zu entschuldigen und zu vergessen, weil wir das jetzt noch mal so ein bisschen unter dem Kontext eben von Uncertainty anschauen werden. Das verändert die Grundlage nicht wahnsinnig, aber es ist vielleicht noch mal einfach ein interessanter Aspekt, den ich auch, wie Sie dann merken werden, im Text mit der Frage unseres SFBs, nämlich der Frage von Vergleichspraktiken, verbinden werde und hoffe, dass dabei irgendwie auch nochmal fruchtbare Ergebnisse, Gedankengänge gekommen sind. Genau, jetzt, okay, I'm going to switch to English, weirdly. So this is just very quickly the larger scale, and you can click twice, book project that this is a part of. And again, you saw that in the beginning on the starting slide. It's a super micro case study in a certain way. So the whole book project, as you can see up here, is a much longer sort of scale perspective on socio-environmental transformations in the Caribbean. And so I just happened upon this situation that I'm going to present to you in a few seconds, which kind of turned out to be this just a very few years kind of take your magnifying glass and kind of look at a very specific few years kind of case study that I'm going to discuss with you, and I'm very curious to hear thoughts and opinions about. So just very briefly, the main focus here for this larger scale book project is that parallel transformation of human societies and natural environments in the Caribbean. With that kind of an evolving environmental knowledge base that kind of is involved in that process, and with that, obviously, also an evolving sort of perception of cultures situated in this new climate, the tropics. Or, I mean, new. It's obviously not new, but for the Spanish colonial situation, it's a very unfamiliar and new situation in 1492 and the following few decades. Then obviously saying what it is not, because there is a lot of research about the Caribbean, about plantations and slavery, so it's not a plantation history, it's not a history exclusively on slavery. Enslaved Africans play an important role, obviously, also in the sort of environmental knowledge base of my sort of like the island I'm looking at, but it's not a sort of a classical study on plantation history and slavery. It's not another remake or another perspective on the Columbian exchange, and it is not Histoire totale. So if you were looking at 1492 to 1804 and we're thinking, well, that's maybe a little long. So obviously there are going to be case studies. Yeah, and so you've seen that already, or you're going to see it, and this is just a sort of perspective on the contents, and I'm going to talk about the second chapter, basically. So that's that first case study, and there is a second case study that looks at the question how climate became an argument for enslaving Africans in the Caribbean specifically. So that's the third chapter I'm not going to talk about, but just as a sort of perspective on what's in that book. Okay, so we are here. This is Hispaniola in the Caribbean, one of the largest islands of the Greater Antilles. Second largest beside Cuba. And so we're going to dive more or less straight into this weird case study of the beginning of the European contact on Hispaniola, on this island. So we kind of are jumping into the history of European discovery of the Americas in Columbus's second voyage to the Caribbean, which is, or to Hispaniola specifically, which happened in 1494. So first one, 1492, well known, second one, 1494. So, and apart from himself, Columbus's journeys were recorded by several 15th and 16th century Spanish chroniclers, whose accounts vary in temporal proximity to the actual events, as well as with regard to the eyewitness status of the authors. Gonzalo Fernández de Oviedo, you can see here, his Historia General y Natural de las Indias, for example, is a relatively late publication with regard to the events described, though he did use first-hand sources in addition to his own observations. Oviedo only stopped on the island in 1514, a point in time where the Arawak, the indigenous population, had already experienced Spanish violence and pathogens for 22 years. The chronicler then took up proper residence in Santo Domingo in the 1530s, which was a time when the original societal structures of the indigenous population had already been disrupted, and Spanish settlers started leaving the island for more promising tierra firme, so Mexico, and other parts of the continent. These circumstances influenced his narrative and rather negative perception of the Arawak. It is well known that Bartolomé de las Casas, so if you are a little familiar with that early American history, you have heard that name, has a much more positive perception of the indigenous peoples of Hispaniola, which he describes in his Historia de las Indias. Las Casas arrived on Hispaniola in 1502, much earlier than Oviedo, which gave him the advantage of seeing the Arawak chieftains at a stage when they were still functioning socio-cultural and economic fabrics. He also had access to a large corpus of documents that later scholars were deprived of. And lastly, we have Pietro Martire d'Anghera and his Decades of the New World. He is an Italian sort of working for the Spanish crown, and he provided an account of Columbus's discovery and subsequent voyages. As opposed to Oviedo and Las Casas, Anghera had, however, never set foot in the Americas and compiled his decades from letters, accounts, and personal interviews of explorers and colonial officials who had. Many of his accounts appear to be exaggerated and, in some places, according to some researchers, I quote, full of rhetoric. So, of course, we have to read these chronicles with reserve, as usual. So, and all three of these accounts mention a famine that occurred on Hispaniola between 1494 and 1496. All three European chroniclers agree that the famine was caused by a malicious ploy of the indigenous people that aimed at starving out the Spanish to cast them from the island. The research literature on the early settlement of Hispaniola deals with this event in the context of the island's early demography and does not question the European narrative of the indigenous ploy to drive out the Spaniards. So research literature is totally fine with that kind of theory. So I would this almost call it a conspiracy theory. This caught my attention when I was sort of started studying and reading into the sources. And it reminded me of accounts from my research on the French settlement of Louisiana, so from earlier research in 1699, and then also of the archaeologist Dennis Blanton's research on the beginnings of the Jamestown colony in 1607, so the first English settlements on the American coast, and also of a colleague's research on Portuguese expeditions to Zimbabwe in the 1570s. In all of these first contact instances, European colonials mention problems with obtaining foodstuffs in unfamiliar environments and their negotiations with the local population they encountered. The Portuguese and the English employed a very similar argument to what the early Spanish chroniclers tell about the Arawak of Hispaniola. European colonists, in the first instance, relied on their own provisions from Europe when setting out on explorations in faraway parts of the earth. This was in line with their humoral-pathological worldview, which held that only their native crops and nourishment would sustain their health, spirits, and character optimally. Once their provisions were depleted, the next riskier and unhealthier option was to fall back on indigenous foodstuffs, be it by friendly exchange or violent appropriation. If the European impostors could not obtain indigenous provisions by either means, they suspected the native populations of maliciously hiding the foodstuffs from them. We know similar patterns of blaming certain social or ethnic groups from early modern European famine research. However, in these cases, the density of historical records and the concrete references of contemporaries to weather phenomena make it easier to connect the famines with climatic anomalies. In other words, for early modern Europe, the entanglement of social and climatic factors can be reconstructed rather clearly in historical hindsight. With regard to suspicions of specific social group tampering with food crops, in a European context, bakers and merchants were often, and sometimes not without reason, suspected of driving up bread prices by hoarding corn. Hoarding was called Fürkauf, as we all know, in German. I had to explain that, obviously, for the English readership. Connected with this was the image of the Kornjude, the corn Jew, which emerged during the 17th century in German-speaking lands, according to Wolfgang Behringer. Wolfgang Behringer, as well as Christian Pfister, have pointed to the link between the climatic anomalies of the Little Ice Age and increases in witch burnings for weather magic. In other words, even if European early modern societies understood the connections between bad weather, crop failures, and famines very clearly, the weather, on the one hand, was still in the hands of God, and bad harvests a sign of his wrath. And on the other hand, the situation led communities to seek for a local outlet for anxiety about the evolving emergency situations. Those outlets were found in the stereotyped figure of the baker, the Jewish corn merchant, or the witch. Now, what happens if this Christian European early modern worldview is transplanted into an unfamiliar environment with an unknown climate in which there is neither an understanding for the seasonality of crop planting, nor for what may be, in 21st century terms, considered as climatically normal circumstances? The American archaeologist Dennis Blanton asked this question in the context of the first English attempts at settling the American East Coast in the Jamestown colony from 1607 onwards. I am using his study as a sort of best practice case for this chapter, despite the fact that it lies chronologically over 100 years ahead of the Spanish case. The limits of this setup will become evident a little further below, or further onwards. Blanton was able to show that the English first contact situation with the indigenous people of the Chesapeake Bay happened during a time of extreme and long-lasting drought by combining archaeological, historical, and climatological evidence from tree rings. He uncovered the English suspicion that the Powhatans were maliciously hiding their food from the newcomers as a misinterpretation by the Europeans and their inability to assess the unfamiliar climate and environment. Importantly, the addition of climate as an explanatory factor for the food scarcity in 1609 and 1610 does not mean we should a priori dismiss the accounts of indigenous groups hiding corn from the English. Rather, it expands our understanding for their doing so, beyond the malice trope assigned by the English contemporaries or other social factors that researchers have since ascribed as a reason. But why has it been so difficult or unintuitive to include the environment and climate as contributing factors for the early hardship of European colonial endeavors in the Americas? Blanton states that in the Jamestown case, I quote, interpretations of the first-person accounts vary in the attribution of hardship, but none of them implicates drought as a significant factor in the first years. The closest explicit mention comes from the native appeal for John Smith to pray for rain. Indeed, this sort of ambiguity still leads to dismissal of the environment as a significant factor in early colonial events. Blanton assigns this absence of references to the environment or the climate to the inexperience of the English newcomers with the natural cycles of their new surroundings. I would venture even one step further and say that as a result of such missing environmental causality, the focus of Jamestown contemporaries moved fully into the social realm. Looking into Captain John Smith is the founder of the Jamestown colony on the Chesapeake Bay. Looking into this account of the English first contact situation on the east coast of North America, the idea of the best practice case study may be biting its own proverbial tail, though in an interesting way with regard to practices of comparing, as we will see presently. So, about halfway into the first volume of that account, John Smith's account, which tells of the English hardship and conflict with the indigenous groups of the Chesapeake Bay, Smith inserts a consideration of the birth pains of rising states. He compares Virginia with Rome, which, I quote, grew by oppression and rose upon the back of her enemies, end of quote, and, unsurprisingly, with the Spaniards who, quote, have had many of those counterbuffs, more than we, end of quote. Smith then gives an account of the Spanish conquest of Hispaniola, including the passage where, quote, the Indians generally conspired together to plant no more at all, intending thereby to famish the Spaniards, themselves in the meantime living upon cassava, a root to make bread, then known to themselves, end of quote. First, the comparison with ancient Rome clearly belongs to a well-established European intellectual repertoire of practices of comparing when it comes to imagining empire. What is more, the comparison with Spain, the great European empire the English were trying to emulate, so still, they were not at the height of their own colonial endeavor yet. So that reinforces the topos of the treacherous Indian that the Spanish had created. In other words, in a Jamestown case, blaming the indigenous population for their hardship may as much have been an effect of English unfamiliarity with the Chesapeake environment as comparing their own situation with that of the Spaniards in Hispaniola a century later. So, which is, again, where this example sort of becomes somewhat circular, but in an interesting way. So, with this comparison situation. Okay. So, back to Columbus and the actual origin story of the treacherous Indian, in quotation marks, of course. In parallel with Blanton's study, I argue that the scarcity of environmental references in the early Spanish chronicles reflects the Europeans' unfamiliarity with their new surroundings and not the absence or irrelevance of such factors. My hypothesis is that the 1494 to 96 famine on Hispaniola may have been similar to the Jamestown situation described by Blanton. That a climatic extreme event, such as a prolonged phase of drought, may have depleted the Arawak food resources in such a way that they were unable to feed the additional 1,500 men Columbus brought with him on his second voyage. Considering the cultural and linguistic barriers, such a deviation from the climatic norm would have been difficult for the Arawak to communicate to European newcomers. So, thinking of probably completely different conceptions of weather, climate, linguistically and culturally, and sort of that kind of transmission having to take place between two populations that did at that point in time not have a very long experience of each other and of each other's languages, etc. So to think that, wouldn't really work. Lacking any longer-term experience with the tropical climate and environment of Hispaniola, the Spanish thus turned to the social sphere in search of an explanation. Following established patterns of explanation for famine and starvation, such as blaming the corn Jew, in quotation marks, mentioned above, they interpreted the unavailability of indigenous foodstuffs as a sly strategy by this newly discovered group of heathens to expel them from the island. In the argumentation of the Spanish chroniclers, framing the absence of foodstuffs as a revenge coup made particular sense in view of the earlier violence of the colonists toward the indigenous population. So the history is basically that after the first voyage of Columbus, he left a few men on the island who then assaulted indigenous women who were then, not the women, but the Spaniards killed all of them. And there was a huge conflict about this, and then Columbus kind of managed to resolve that. But obviously that was kind of an underlying story that would explain such counter-violence or revenge violence by the indigenous population. Las Casas writes about the perceived indigenous unwillingness to provide the Spaniards with food that, quote, and you can read this on the slide as well, that, quote, many of them, the Arawaks, decided to assist them, the Spaniards, with a trick or a warning so that they would die or leave the island. The warning was this, even though it had the contrary effect of what they expected. The Indians neither sowed nor did they work their canucos. Canucos are sort of raised fields where they would plant cassava, so that no harvest would be obtained on the island. Danguera, in his De Orbe Novo Decades, on the other hand, writes, Columbus was informed that the natives suffered from such a severe famine that more than 50,000 men had already perished, and that people continued to die daily as cattle in time of a pest. This calamity was the consequence of their own folly. For when they saw that the Spaniards wished to settle in their island, they thought they might expel them by creating a scarcity of food. They therefore declined not only to plant no more crops, but also to destroy and tear up all the various kinds of cereals used for bread, which had already been sown. Danguera starts with the indigenous famine and only in a second step assigns it to the Arawak strategy of uprooting the already planted crops to starve out the Spaniards. A little further on in his account, he describes the Spanish introduction of tribute payments upon the Arawak, but that the famine prevented them from achieving such payments, and that they begged Columbus to, quote, have pity on their misery, and to exempt them till such time as the island might recover from its former prosperity, end of quote. In the first part of the account, the human agency as a cause for the famine seems to be clear, though it almost comes as an afterthought. The following paragraphs, where the Arawak ask for a delay of tribute payments, does not repeat that connection to their own folly, quotation marks. So it is possible to assume that the trope of destroying their own crops may be a European substitute for an otherwise unexplainable food scarcity. So, question, is it possible to assume that? Fernández de Oviedo's Historia General, in particular, provides clues that may support this hypothesis. Similar to what Blanton observes for the historical records in the case of Jamestown, neither Fernández de Oviedo nor the other chroniclers make direct remarks about local weather conditions that they connect to the famine. Again, it's important to underline that despite the search for culprits in the social realm, some of the natural causality of climatic extreme events was well understood in medieval and early modern Europe. Grape harvest dates, high water levels in rivers, storms, and extreme cold or heat were regularly noted in church chronicles or other chronicles. In other words, the practice of observing local weather conditions was well established. The scarcity of references to weather or the environment is therefore conspicuous and would rather support the claim that it does not signify absence of phenomena, but absence of familiarity with phenomena. But back to Oviedo. And here he is. He echoes Las Casas and Danguera in saying the Arawak had invented a malicious ploy, un mal ardid in Spanish, after they had realized that the Spaniards were planning on settling for good on the island. So, quote, because of this, more than half of the Spaniards died, and of the Indians, so many died that they could not be counted. And this occurred in such a way that it could not be prevented or understood, because this land was so new for the Christians, they could not carry out the work they were accustomed to, nor did they understand it. And it occurred thus. All Indians of this province agreed not to sow anything at the time when they should have done it. And as they did not have maize, they ate yucca, which are the two kinds of bread and the main means of sustenance that exist in this country. The Christians ate their own foodstuffs, and when those were finished, they sought to help themselves to the crops of the earth which the Indians cultivated. But they didn't have any, neither for themselves nor for the Spaniards. In this way, many men died of hunger in this city of the Christians. Oviedo continued that the fort of Santo Tomás had experienced the same fate, that half of its Spanish population had died of hunger, and that the Arawak had been even more severely affected by the famine. Quote, in this way, the Indians carried out their malicious plan of expelling the Christians from the island for lack of provisions. End of quote. Even though such historic mortality figures have to be treated with caution, Oviedo's account coincides quite well with the death toll Dennis Blanton reconstructs in his Jamestown study. He speaks of a mortality rate of about 60% of Europeans and indigenous. Of course, it could be entirely correct to take Las Casas, Danguera, and Oviedo by their word and interpret the events of 1494 to 96 as a war strategy of the Arawak, in which they were prepared to accept the mass death of their own people. The research currently dealing with the famine assumes a mixture of such a war strategy combined with European diseases and overwork as a reason for high mortality rates. For example, George Rodzens, in a 1996 article that compares the European invasions of Hispaniola and Virginia, claims that, quote, passive resistance led them, the Arawaks, to destroy their own food so that the Spanish would also starve, end of quote. In light of the results of Blanton's study and of what we know about early modern perceptions of famines and extreme events, I am not convinced by this at face value acceptance of primary accounts. I find the idea that a society would commit mass suicide by destroying its own food sources, even under the shocking circumstances of Spanish violence and pathogens, rather implausible. If we were to believe in the starving out account, should we not trust that in such a scenario, people who were intimately familiar with the environment and topography of their island, as the Arawak, would have been as smart as creating a secret stash of foodstuffs in order to bring the war strategy to fruition and secure the survival of their own community? To clarify, I do not argue for climatic factors as a single cause for the 1494 famine, in particular in light of the convincing evidence regarding European diseases and violent coercion as factors that would disrupt agricultural activity and may thus already create an impasse in food provision. But I would like to introduce climatic factors into the debate as one, possibly as a decisive factor, as decisive factor as those others that should be considered. Even if we have to get to climatic factors via several detours, as the historical records do not speak about what we would call climatic phenomena explicitly. Statement about the land being so new to the colonists, Oviedo provides a contemporary explanation for the difficulty of the Spaniards to read their unfamiliar environment properly. The missing maize and the shift to yucca, a root crop also known as cassava or manioc, could very well be related to climatic factors such as extreme drought, as a sort of emergency food crop. Furthermore, the fact that Oviedo states that the indigenous population did not have crops for themselves, nor for the Spaniards, could be an indication that this was precisely not a strategy, but a possibly larger scale environmental phenomenon that was contributing to the situation. This latter assumption is substantiated by Oviedo's account of Santo Tomás, about 100 kilometers further southeast of La Isabela, the city he talks about, which experienced the same fate. From my current point of view, there are two scenarios which may provide an explanation for the 1494 to 1906 famine. The scenario A would be climatic factors did not play a role. The famine was caused by the mass death of the Arawak due to European diseases and the consequent situation that not enough people were available to plant maize and yucca. A point that remains somewhat implausible in this scenario is why the Spaniards should not have managed to nourish themselves under normal climatic circumstances in an environment that was invariably described as abundant in flora and fauna, particularly fish, by contemporaries. So we have geographers' accounts that are very flowery about the riches of that environment. And scenario B, climatic factors did play a role, even though we do not have verbal descriptions of conditions that could have affected human food production, at least not in the kind of terminology that we might expect from a present-day point of view. We know from the early chronicles that in 1494, as well as 1495, Hispaniola was hit by hurricanes. In the month of June, I quote, of this same year, 1494, occurred a frightful tempest. Whirlwinds reaching to the skies uprooted the largest trees that were swept within their vortex. It is said that in that year, the sea penetrated more deeply than usual into the earth, and that it rose more than a cubit. End of quote. Wrote Danguera about the 1494 hurricane. The additional information he gives about the flood depth caused by the hurricane is interesting with regard to assessing its strength. Since the hurricane seasons of 2017 and 2019 have proven exceptionally destructive for the islands of the Caribbean, I do not have to argue for the fact that what we perceive as devastating storms today, even minus the increased strength through climate change, would have been devastating for historically less developed societies back then. Particularly on agricultural crops, particularly a maize harvest would have been easily raised by a hurricane. Climatologically, active hurricane seasons and an increase in sea surface temperatures in the Caribbean are associated with La Nina conditions in the cold phase, the cold phase, cooling sea surface temperatures in the Pacific off the coast of Peru, of the climatic phenomenon known as the El Nino Southern Oscillation. So we have it has two phases. The El Nino phase is the warm Pacific, and the La Nina is the cold Pacific, with sort of the other side, the Atlantic basin, being warmer than usual, and warm sea surface temperatures sort of increase hurricane strength and make hurricanes more likely. So if this is coupled with a southerly position, so you're getting some climate information here now, bear with me. If this is coupled with a southerly position of a second important climatic system known as the Intertropical Convergence Zone, or ITCZ, hurricanes are more likely to take a more southerly course and hit the Caribbean archipelago rather than entering the Gulf of Mexico or affecting the east coast of the US. Clues from a historical reconstruction of such ENSO data point to a multi-year La Nina phase between 1492 and 1495. So from the natural sciences and climatic reconstructions, we have indications that this could have been sort of a factor as well. Oviedo, though he did not write about weather phenomena in a causal relation with the famine, continued his account of 1494 by saying that the exhaustion and fatigues of the Spaniards were ongoing, and then that to top things off, quote, winds were blowing from the north, which in Castilla are called cierzo, and which make this island sick, end of quote. The references to fatigues, sickness, and north winds are very inconclusive and hard to place in a causal relationship. Nevertheless, they are significant, since the effects seem to hit Spaniards and Arawak alike, and no references are made anymore to the plan of the indigenous population to oust the Spaniards. What is more, similar wording reappears in the colonial correspondence of the Santo Domingan Cabildo of the 16th century, indicating environmental stress on the island. So I have looked through several of these correspondences throughout the 16th century, and we have a lot of mentionings of sick land, etc., that kind of point to these environmental factors. So, apart from the so far admittedly inconclusive and uncertain evidence for a climatic factor hypothesis from the human archives that my examples share with Blanton's, could the natural archives, that is paleoclimatic proxy records, provide more information about environmental conditions at the time of the 1494 to 96 famine? Before we look into possible answers to these questions, first a short orientation as to the climatological epoch in which our Hispaniolan famine example is set. So a little more climatological information for you all. It's not going to take too long. So, what's that epoch we're in? Over the last decade, it has become common for climate and early modern historians to speak about the Little Ice Age. Some of you may have heard of it. An era of decreased air temperature of the northern hemisphere by more or less 0.6 to 0.8 degrees. It doesn't sound like much, but it was quite significant. That some climatologists said to start in 1400, others already at 1250, and lasting until 1800 or 1850. So there are different sort of timings by different researchers given for the Little Ice Age. All of them have their arguments that do make sense. So there is no kind of right story in a sense. And it is misleading in a way, and it's kind of difficult to sort of get this straight because it sounds like that, the Little Ice Age. So it's misleading to think of the Little Ice Age as a period of uniformly colder conditions, since local effects varied greatly. So we have an up and down of temperatures that is quite confusing looking at it. Reduced solar irradiation and an uptick in global volcanic activity have been suggested as causes for the Little Ice Age. And because I have this wonderful slide here, you can see these are volcanic eruptions So the Maunder minimum may be familiar to some of you as well. It mostly covers the 17th century and is kind of coincides with the crisis of the 17th century, which is or has been a topic in economic history for a while. And obviously, since climate historians have come into the mix, it's been retaken up. It used to be just an economic history subject, and now climate historians have come in and said, "Hang on." Yeah, so that's here, and the Spörer minimum is sort of another cold phase. And I'm sort of pointing to the Northern Hemisphere specifically, so this is also important neuro research. The Little Ice Age is not a global phenomenon, it is a specifically Northern Hemispheric phenomenon, which is kind of why it's also not dodgy, but difficult, for me, doing research in the tropics is still a sort of ongoing process to sort of see, are there actually researchers who are doing proper, good paleoclimatological research on the Little Ice Age in the tropics? So, difficult. So solar irradiation, meaning the strength of solar radiation arriving on the surface of the globe. And we can see a sort of low here in these two minima, and then here the uptick in volcanic eruptions. So I'm sure my volcanic eruption colleagues would be able to name all of these. That's not super interesting, so I'm going to leave it at this, but you can see this is kind of why it's called the Little Ice Age, and basically this is also the era, the two eras, and specifically this one that I'm looking at. While the socio-environmental cooling effects of the beginning of the Little Ice Age is well documented for Northern Europe, evidence of equally significant effects on the Little Ice Age on the tropics has started to come together more recently. Due to the relative dearth of documentary evidence from the early Little Ice Age period in the American tropics, as evidenced in my examples above, the data for this region is so far overwhelmingly stems from the natural archives, meaning speleothems, which is Tropfsteine, lake sediments, mostly, lagoon sediments, etc. 3 recent papers on climatic conditions in the Caribbean during the Little Ice Age converge in interesting ways in their findings. All 3 state that during the Little Ice Age, conditions in the Circumcaribbean turned significantly drier compared to earlier periods of observation. Lane et al. State that these drought conditions were identified for geographically distinct regions such as the Yucatan Peninsula, Panama, northern South America, Puerto Rico, and along the southern slope of the Dominican Republic's Cordillera Central, where they took their sediments. This underlines the fact that these changing climatic conditions of the Little Ice Age not only affected isolated areas, but were of a synoptic scale extension. Lane et al.'s evidence from northern South America indicate that the Little Ice Age might have been the driest period of the last 10,000 years in the Circumcaribbean. These indications from recent paleoclimate studies with lake sediment samples from Hispaniola and nearby Jamaica are highly significant with regard to our question of the influence of climatic factors and support my hypothesis to a certain extent. Yet, the temporal resolution of sake lediment cores, that is, the possibility to assign soil layers that indicate drought to specific years. If you take a lake sediment, it doesn't have years somewhere, right? So it's kind of difficult and not a very sort of exact science to do that. That's rather rough compared to a proxy such as tree rings, on the other hand. Tree rings are very clearly seasonally or annually resolved kind of natural data. So to have tree rings would be beautiful, but it's difficult because in the tropics we usually don't have trees with very strong tree rings because the seasons aren't very expressed or marked. In other words, more fine-grained analyses of climatic conditions at the time of Columbus's arrival on the island have yet to be made. Or in Lane et al.'s conclusive sentence, I quote, "The potential impacts of Little Ice Age aridity on human society warrant further attention." End of quote. Yes, so I'm wishing for them to do more research. So in light of the evidence from the National Archives, I will close my argument for scenario B and climatic factors with the tentative assumption that the 1494 to 1906 famine on Hispaniola was caused by the combined factors of a prolonged drought, repeated damages to food crops from hurricanes, as well as by the indigenous mortality rates caused by European epidemics and by European violence mentioned in scenario A above. After this somewhat meandering walk through the Spanish first contact situation on Hispaniola and climatic evidence from paleoclimate studies, where does this leave us with regards to practices of comparing and uncertainty? How did comparison play a role in these early years of Spanish presence in an unfamiliar environment and climate? Historically, practices of comparing are most easily to be discovered in written sources where two units, or comparata, are compared with regard to a third, the tertium comparationis, as all of our SFB members know. It is rather more difficult to account for practices of comparing that we have to infer or historically reconstruct because they did not form part of a discourse or were not made explicit in writing. I would suggest that the 1494 to 1906 famine on Hispaniola is such a case of a non-discursive comparative practice and at the same time a situation of high uncertainty because of incomparability. I arrive at the latter, high uncertainty, through incomparability. Not so much by the appraisal of the contemporaries themselves, but rather by inference through historical analysis. Let me explain. By analogy with Blanton's study of Jamestown, which has the advantage of paleoclimate evidence to underline its claim, I have set up the hypothesis that the Spanish in Hispaniola had been even more clearly in a situation of unfamiliarity with the unknown natural and social environment of the New World than the English 100 years later. They could at least refer back to the Spanish experience and their accounts of first contact. For the Spaniards in 1492, unfamiliarity with the new environment literally meant incomparability of phenomena on the experiential level, and hence, through the resulting uncertainty, a necessity to draw on the homegrown patterns of social and environmental knowledge from Spain and ancient Greece. This environmental unfamiliarity and hence the absence of a local frame of reference is briefly mentioned by Fernández de Oviedo in his account of the famine. This is the implicit reason given by contemporaries themselves for the incomparability of phenomena. This incomparability of the environmental realm and the consequent search for causality in the social sphere led to the projection of the conspiracy theory of the treacherous food-hiding Indian that is referenced by the English on the Chesapeake Bay a century later. From the Spanish chronicler's accounts, it emerges then that discursive as well as non-discursive practices of comparing can be constitutive for entangled histories. There we are. In particular, with regards to environmental factors. The early inter-American and transatlantic entanglement is underlined by the fact that Spanish conquest reports were used for comparison by the English, and that with the arrival of the English on the Chesapeake Bay, the conspiracy theory spread to this new region and was presented to a new audience.